The meeting of Guderian's and Kleist's forces at Lokvica on September 16th completed the encirclement. German radio communications confirmed the link-up, and panzer divisions established defensive positions facing both inward toward the pocket and outward against potential Soviet relief attempts. The encirclement was initially a loose ring that Soviet forces might have broken through with coordinated attacks, but German reinforcements rapidly strengthened the ring into an impenetrable barrier. Within days, the pocket was sealed securely enough that large-scale Soviet breakout became impossible. The geography of the Kiev pocket worked against Soviet forces attempting to escape or defend. The pocket stretched roughly 150 kilometers from north to south and perhaps 100 kilometers from east to west at its widest point. The terrain was open steppe and agricultural land that offered minimal defensive advantages and favored German mobile operations. The Dnieper River, running through Kiev, prevented easy movement westward for forces east of the city. The road and rail networks that Soviet forces depended on for supply converged on Kiev, making them vulnerable to German air attack and artillery fire. The Soviet forces trapped in the Kiev pocket included some of the Red Army's most experienced and capable units. The 5th Army, 21st Army, 26th Army, and 37th Army represented substantial combat power that had fought effectively in earlier defensive battles. The personnel included veterans of the Finnish War and the initial weeks of the German invasion, who had learned hard lessons about modern warfare. The loss of these forces would eliminate not just numerical strength, but also experienced soldiers and officers who could not be quickly replaced. General Kirponos, commanding the southwestern front from within the developing pocket, had understood the military necessity of retreat, but had been bound by Stalin's orders to hold positions. Kirponos was an experienced and capable officer who had commanded successfully in earlier campaigns. His requests to withdraw were professional military assessments, not panic or defeatism. When those requests were denied, Kirponos attempted to execute impossible orders, organizing defenses against the encirclement while also trying to maintain positions around Kiev. The contradictory missions guaranteed failure. Kirponos had assumed command of the southwestern front in June 1941 and had led his forces through the initial German onslaught. He had demonstrated tactical competence in defensive battles and had maintained organizational cohesion through retreats that saw other Soviet fronts collapse into chaos. His military record included service in the Spanish Civil War and successful command of the Leningrad military district. Stalin had trusted him sufficiently to give him command of one of the Soviet Union's most important fronts. This trust made Kirponos's warnings about the developing encirclement more credible, but did not make Stalin more willing to accept them. The communications between Kirponos and Moscow in mid-September documented the progressive realization that catastrophe was unfolding. Kirponos reported German forces closing the encirclement from north and south. He reported that his forces lacked the mobility to break out of the developing pocket. He reported ammunition and fuel shortages that would prevent sustained combat, even if breakout was authorized. The reports became increasingly urgent as the situation deteriorated. Stalin's responses, relayed through the general staff, continued to insist on holding Kiev and preventing German advances without providing the forces or resources necessary to accomplish those missions. Kirponos's final messages before the encirclement closed completely demonstrated his recognition that his front was being destroyed. He requested permission to withdraw the armies still east of Kiev to positions behind the same river, where they might establish new defensive lines. He requested authorization for forces already encircled to break out to the east while breakout was still possible. He requested air support to attack the German panzer spearheads closing the encirclement. Each request was denied or ignored, and the responses from Moscow continued to demand that Kiev be held and that Soviet forces prevent German operational freedom. Marshal Semyon Budyonny, commanding the southwestern direction, which included the southwestern front, had been more explicit in his warnings to Stalin about the developing disaster. Budyonny was a Civil War hero whose military reputation rested on cavalry operations rather than modern mechanized warfare. His understanding of operational warfare was limited, but even Budyonny could see that the encirclement developing around Kiev would destroy the southwestern front if withdrawal was not authorized immediately. Budyonny's telegrams to Stalin in early September were blunt assessments that contradicted Stalin's insistence on holding Kiev. He reported that German forces were executing a double envelopment and that Soviet forces must withdraw immediately or face encirclement and destruction. He reported that the forces available to prevent encirclement were inadequate and that reinforcements were not available in time to change the outcome. His assessment was that holding Kiev while preventing encirclement was impossible with available forces, and choosing withdrawal was militarily necessary. Stalin's response to Budyonny's warnings was to remove him from command of the southwestern direction, replacing him with Marshal Semyon Timoshenko. The change in command did nothing to alter the military situation, but signaled Stalin's displeasure with Budyonny's assessments. Timoshenko, who assumed command on September 13th as the encirclement was closing, inherited an impossible situation. His orders were still to hold Kiev and prevent encirclement, but the forces and time necessary to accomplish either objective no longer existed.
The reports reached Stalin's office in the Kremlin on September 19, 1941, confirming what his military advisors had been warning for weeks, but what he had refused to accept. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine and the Soviet Union's third-largest city, had fallen to German forces. The southwestern front, commanded by Marshal Semyon Budyonny, had collapsed in the largest encirclement battle in military history. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in the pocket east of Kiev, surrounded by German panzer divisions that had executed a double envelopment of stunning operational precision. The city that Stalin had ordered held at all costs had been lost, and the forces defending it were being systematically destroyed. Stalin's response to the news was not the explosive rage that often characterized his reactions to military setbacks. Instead, there was a cold, calculating silence as he processed the magnitude of the disaster. Kiev's fall represented not just the loss of a major city, but the destruction of the largest concentration of Soviet military power on the southern front. The encirclement would eliminate entire armies, kill or capture experienced commanders, and open the route to the industrial regions of eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. The catastrophe validated warnings from General Georgy Zhukov and other military professionals that Stalin had dismissed as defeatism. The path to the Kiev disaster had been set in motion weeks earlier when German forces under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock had pivoted from the advance toward Moscow to support Army Group South's operations in Ukraine. Hitler had overruled his generals, who wanted to continue the Moscow offensive, instead directing that Kiev be captured and Ukraine occupied before resuming operations toward the Soviet capital. The decision reflected Hitler's assessment that economic objectives in Ukraine were more important than the political objective of capturing Moscow. General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group had driven south from the Moscow axis, while General Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group advanced north from Army Group South's positions. The two panzer forces met east of Kiev on September 16th, completing an encirclement of Soviet forces that had remained in and around the city despite increasingly desperate tactical situations. The Soviet commanders trapped in the pocket, General Mikhail Kirponos commanding the southwestern front, General Semyon Timoshenko coordinating operations, and numerous Army and Corps commanders had requested permission to withdraw eastward before the encirclement closed. Stalin had refused. Stalin's refusal to authorize withdrawal from Kiev reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of modern mobile warfare and his political imperative that Soviet forces never voluntarily surrender territory. Kiev held enormous symbolic importance as the ancient capital of Rus, the historical and cultural heart of Ukraine, and a major Soviet city whose loss would be a propaganda victory for Germany. Stalin convinced himself that Soviet forces could hold Kiev while simultaneously preventing encirclement, despite the operational reality that these objectives were incompatible given German mobility and Soviet defensive weaknesses. The warnings Stalin had received about the developing encirclement were explicit and urgent. Zhukov, serving as chief of the General Staff, had reported that German panzer forces were executing a pincer movement that would trap the southwestern front if immediate withdrawal was not authorized. Marshal Boris Shapashnikov, Zhukov's predecessor as chief of the General Staff, who maintained an advisory role, had supported Zhukov's assessment. Frontline commanders, including Kirponos, had sent increasingly desperate requests for authorization to retreat while retreat was still possible. Stalin's rejection of these warnings stemmed from multiple factors that reinforced each other. His ideological conviction that Soviet forces should never retreat voluntarily made him suspicious of military advice to withdraw. His political concern that authorizing retreat would be seen as weakness, both domestically and internationally, made him resistant to recommendations that emphasized Soviet military inadequacy. His personal authority was invested in previous orders to hold Kiev, making it psychologically difficult to reverse those orders without appearing to have made errors. The combination of ideological, political, and psychological factors created certainty that Kiev could and must be held, despite military assessments to the contrary. The dismissal of Zhukov from his position as Chief of the General Staff in late July, though officially described as a transfer to Field Command, was partly a consequence of his persistent warnings about Kiev and other operational matters where his professional military judgment conflicted with Stalin's political imperatives. Zhukov's replacement by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky did not change the military reality, but did reduce the frequency and directness of warnings reaching Stalin. Vasilevsky understood that Stalin did not want to hear assessments that contradicted his decisions, and he moderated his reporting accordingly. The execution of the German encirclement demonstrated operational capabilities that Soviet forces in September 1941 could not match. Guderian's panzer divisions covered hundreds of kilometers in days, maintaining coordination with Kleist's forces despite operating across vast distances. German air superiority prevented Soviet forces from interdicting the advancing panzer columns, or even obtaining accurate intelligence about their positions. The Luftwaffe attacked Soviet command posts, communication centers, and troop concentrations, disrupting coordination and morale. By the time Soviet commanders fully understood the encirclement was closing, escape was already becoming impossible. The operational coordination between Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group advancing from the north and Kleist's 1st Panzer Group advancing from the south demonstrated German mastery of mobile warfare at its peak. The two panzer forces moved rapidly along axes that brought them together east of Kiev, closing the trap before Soviet forces could react effectively. Guderian's drive southward from the Desna River covered over 200 kilometers in a week, penetrating deep into the rear of Soviet forces defending Kiev. The speed of advance outpaced Soviet ability to respond. Soviet units that attempted to block the German advance found themselves outflanked or bypassed as panzer divisions exploited gaps and maintained momentum. German doctrine of leading with reconnaissance to identify weak points, concentrating armor for breakthrough, and bypassing strong points to maintain operational tempo was executed with precision that Soviet forces could not match. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group executed a similar advance from the south, breaking through Soviet defensive lines and driving north toward the link-up with Guderian's forces.
The breakthrough required overcoming Soviet defenses that had been strengthened specifically to prevent encirclement. But German combined arms coordination, tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, and air support, operating in integrated fashion, proved overwhelming.